There exists on the Indian subcontinent the ruins of a civilization that once sheltered 40,000 human beings, perhaps more, in orderly brick-built streets and measured plazas. And yet we have found no palace, no throne room, no single monument to a ruler's glory, no image of conquest carved into stone. What kind of society builds a great city and chooses not to crown a king? What arrangement of human hearts and minds could organize tens of thousands of people across an area larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and leave almost no trace of the authority that held them together? These questions have haunted archaeologists and historians for more than a century, ever since the first dusty artifacts began surfacing from beneath the earth of Pakistan and northwestern India. And if you find yourself drawn to mysteries of this kind, to the notion that there might have been entirely different ways for human beings to live together, to trade, to build, and to endure, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel, because over the coming hours, we will walk through the silent streets of this civilization as it existed 5,000 years ago, and we will try to piece together the remarkable story of the Indus Valley, the entire story of a city of 40,000 with no kings and no weapons. But first, we must find ourselves there. Imagine, if your awareness will allow, a landscape before dawn. The year is 2500 before the Common Era, somewhere along the immense floodplain that the Indus River carved into the earth over millennia of seasonal rising and falling. The sky is not yet light, but it is no longer wholly dark. It exists in that suspended moment between night and the first touch of morning, when the world seems to hold its breath and wait. The air is thick with moisture. The Indus, several miles away, has recently swollen with the runoff from distant mountains, and the plain drinks it in, releasing a gentle, mineral haze that clings to everything. This is not the sharp chill of true cold, but rather a cool dampness that speaks of water, of silt, of the earth remembering what it has received. You can almost taste it on your lips, a faint earthiness, a cleanness that comes from soil and riverstone, from the slow dissolution of clay. The river itself is not yet visible in this pre-dawn murk, but you can sense it. You can sense the weight of it, the slow, patient movement of water carrying sediment from the mountains down toward the Arabian Sea, a journey it has undertaken for hundreds of thousands of years and will continue to undertake long after the city we are about to witness has been buried and forgotten. The Indus is ancient beyond measure, and yet it is the bloodstream of this civilization, the reason these people built here, why they chose this plain, why they remain. Around you, though the light has not yet come, the city begins to take shape in your mind's eye. The sound of it comes first, not loudness, but a kind of presence, the gentle creak of wooden gates, the soft clink of something being set down, a tool perhaps, or a vessel. The breath of living things, human and animal, as the city prepares to wake. There are no alarms, no horns calling people to labor, no bells, just the natural stirring of a place inhabited by 40,000 souls as they begin another day. The streets, even in this darkness, have a quality of order about them. You sense the right angles before you see them. The baked brick of which the buildings are constructed has dried over days and months in the relentless sun, and even now, hours before sunrise, the earth still radiates the warmth it absorbed. The smell of brick dust hangs in the humid air, a faint, powdery presence that has become so much a part of the atmosphere that no one living here would notice it anymore. To them, this smell is simply the smell of home, of the material substance from which their world is built. The bricks themselves are everywhere, not haphazardly placed, but methodically arranged, their dimensions remarkably uniform, as though crafted by a single hand, multiplied across thousands of workers. These bricks will be one of the great mysteries we encounter in the morning light. How they achieved such consistency, what mathematics or standard had been agreed upon, whether there existed something like a rule or a guild that ensured every brick conformed to the same proportions. But for now, in this dim hour, they are simply the substance of the city, the bones of its skeleton. Beneath the streets, though you cannot see them, runs an infrastructure that would astound someone from the ancient world visiting from Mesopotamia or Egypt. There are drains. Actual drains, baked into channels, running beneath buildings and plazas, designed with such care that they slope gently toward the river, toward the marshes, toward anywhere but the place where people live and work. Water, the great sustainer of life, but also its threat, has been managed with a thoughtfulness that speaks to organized planning. Someone has imagined a vision of how a city should function, and others have labored to bring it into being. The mist clings to all of this, softening edges, blurring the distinction between what is built and what is natural. There is something almost peaceful in this indistinctness. For a moment, the city seems not like a creation of human will imposed upon the landscape, but rather something that has emerged from the landscape itself, as if the earth had slowly organized itself into streets and rooms and storage facilities, as if the river had whispered instructions to the people, and they had simply listened and obeyed. But the dawn is coming. The sky, at its eastern edge, is beginning to lighten, not quite gold, not yet, but a deeper blue, yielding to a lighter one. Soon the sun will clear the horizon, and with it, the details will emerge. The facades of buildings will become visible, their entrances and windows, the patterns sometimes left in their brickwork as decoration, or perhaps as simple variation in the work of many hands. The streets will reveal themselves more fully, their width, their drainage systems, the evidence of feet that have walked them 10,000 times, perhaps 100,000 times over the centuries. And in that light, we will begin to ask our questions in earnest. Because what we are about to witness, what archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered over decades of excavation, is not what we expect a civilization to look like. There is something missing, something that should be there, according to everything we think we know about how human beings organize themselves when they grow numerous and settle into cities. The light spreads, the mist begins to thin. The city of the Indus Valley is waking into memory, and we are here to listen. Imagine walking through the ruins of a city that once held 40,000 people, perhaps more, streets laid out in perfect grids, homes of baked brick, uniform and sturdy, sophisticated drainage systems carrying water beneath the streets. And yet, as your eyes move across the archaeological record, across the remnants that have survived 5,000 years of weather and forgetting, a peculiar absence begins to form itself into a question. Where are the palaces? Where are the thrones? In nearly every ancient civilization we have ever known, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, the Maya, the archaeological landscape is dominated by the monumental seats of power, the tombs of pharaohs, the ziggurats of kings, the oracle bones of emperors. The symbols and the stones speak plainly of hierarchy, of concentrated authority, of one figure or one family wielding dominion over the many. And yet here, in the Indus Valley civilization that flourished along the floodplains and tributaries of the Indian subcontinent, something entirely different seems to have taken root. No royal palaces have been found, no obvious royal inscriptions, no depictions of kings being crowned or conquering enemies, no grand monuments erected to glorify a single ruler. This is, in itself, already remarkable enough to pause upon, but there is something more, something that deepens the mystery even further. Throughout the countless Mesopotamian cities of the same period, through the burial sites and the temple grounds and the palace walls, we find illustrations of warfare, we find weapons, we find chariots. We find the material and artistic evidence of conquest and conflict, and the assertion of dominion through force. In the Indus Valley, by contrast, weapons are conspicuously rare. No swords have turned up in the hands of skeletons. No fortified walls surround the major cities in the way that defense requires. No depictions of battle adorn the seals, or the pottery, or the walls. What emerges, then, is a civilization that appears to have been organized not through the vertical arrangements of monarchy and military might, but through something altogether different, perhaps through councils, perhaps through merchant guilds and the shared interests of trade. perhaps through a more horizontal distribution of authority that we, shaped as we are by thousands of years of kingdoms and empires, find almost difficult to comprehend. This is not to say that the Indus Valley was egalitarian in the way we might imagine an idealized community. The evidence speaks of craft specialization, of varying degrees of wealth, of organized labor on a massive scale. But the way that organization was maintained, the mechanisms by which tens of thousands of people coordinated their lives and their work and their civic projects, that remains, even now, one of the deepest enigmas of ancient history. And perhaps that is precisely why this civilization continues to hold such a particular grip on our imagination. In a modern world where power is so visibly and so relentlessly concentrated, where monuments to individual leaders are everywhere, where the assertion of dominion through display and force seems almost inevitable, the Indus Valley whispers a different possibility. It suggests that human beings, given the right circumstances and the right motivations, might organize themselves in ways that leave no palace behind, no throne, no war crown for any single ruler. Of course, we must tread carefully here. The absence of evidence is not always the evidence of absence. We do not yet fully understand the Indus Valley civilization because it has not yet fully revealed itself. The script that its people used to write remains, frustratingly and provocatively, undeciphered. And so much of what we might have learned from their own words and records remains locked away in symbols that have not yet been translated. We see what archaeologists have found, the objects, the structures, the remains, but we do not hear the voices that once filled these cities. We can make educated guesses about governance and social organization, but we cannot, not yet, know for certain how the Indus Valley people understood their own society. Yet even in that profound uncertainty, there is something worth lingering with. There is something in the quiet absence of thrones and weapons, in the evidence of cities that seem to have been planned and organized and maintained without the domineering presence of a king, that invites us to imagine differently, to wonder, to sit with the possibility that human civilization has taken many forms, and that not all of them have required hierarchy imposed from above, or victory achieved through force, or the glorification of a single name. If you find yourself drawn to the deepest mysteries of human organization, to the question of how societies without obvious kings have built their cities and coordinated their efforts, I would invite you to stay with us as we unfold the full story of the Indus Valley, to journey through the archaeological evidence as it has been pieced together, to walk the streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa with all their puzzles still intact, to trace the trade networks that extended across 3,000 kilometers, and to sit in the long quiet of a civilization that may have discovered something about human life that we have since forgotten. The story of the Indus Valley is, in many ways, the story of what happens when you truly listen to the silence that archaeology leaves behind. To understand where this civilization rose, we must begin with water. The Indus River, that great serpent of South Asia, flows from the high glaciers of the Karakoram and Hindu Kush mountains, winding through some of the most ancient terrain on earth. For thousands of years, this river has been the giver and taker of life, flooding seasonally with such regularity that the floodplains became gardens of silt and possibility. The people who would build this vast, organized civilization chose to settle not on the river's edge, but across an entire network of river valleys that stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, an expanse so large that you could walk for weeks and still be within the reach of their settlements. The geography of this world was shaped by two great river systems working in concert, though one of them would eventually betray its people. The Indus itself carved its path through the western reaches, but running parallel to it, further south and east, was another river, or rather, a system of rivers that scholars now call the Ghaggar Hakra. This second river, now mostly dry, once flowed with seasonal abundance, and between these two great waterways lay a plain of such richness that it could support not merely villages, but cities, cities of 40,000 souls or more. The rivers were not obstacles to overcome, but threads to follow, pathways that connected hundreds of settlements in a loose web of commerce, culture, and shared understanding. Picture, if you will, the geography as it existed around 5,000 years ago. From the mouths of these rivers, where they met the Arabian Sea, that warm body of water that would become a highway for traders moving spices and dyed cotton toward distant shores, the civilization stretched inland in a vast, gradual climb. The floodplains near the coast were flat and generous, offering easy access to maritime trade. Moving northward and eastward, the terrain rose almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as one approached the foothills of the Himalayas themselves. The northern reaches of their world were bounded by mountains of such grandeur that they seemed to touch the sky, while the southern reaches dissolved into the Arabian Sea and the delta lands where river met ocean. The Indus Valley civilization did not cluster in a single region, but sprawled across a territory that modern scholars estimate at roughly 500,000 square miles. That is an area larger than modern-day Afghanistan, larger than France. Within this vast expanse, archaeologists have identified the remains of more than 1,500 settlements, ranging from small farming villages of a few hundred people to major urban centers. What is remarkable is not the size of the territory, but how similarly organized these settlements appear to be, as if guided by some shared blueprint or common understanding of how a community should arrange itself. The river systems that sustained this world were both predictable and treacherous. Each year, as monsoon rains fell on the mountains to the north, the rivers would rise, sometimes violently. The floods could be catastrophic, sweeping away crops and dwellings, yet they also deposited fresh layers of silt that renewed the soil. The people who chose to build here learned to anticipate this cycle, to work with it rather than against it, and the archaeological record suggests they were remarkably successful at managing these annual gifts and threats. The soil itself became a kind of constant currency, rich, deep, and endlessly renewable as long as the rivers continued to flow. Between the two great river valleys lay elevated lands, plateaus and ridges that the settlements of the Indus civilization clustered around with particular care. Why did they choose these locations? Perhaps because the higher ground offered a degree of protection from the worst flooding, or perhaps because the slightly raised terrain allowed for better drainage and the development of more sophisticated water management systems. The settlements were rarely directly on the riverbanks themselves, but rather set back at a distance that suggests careful calculation and long experience. Distance enough to avoid the worst of the seasonal floods, yet close enough that irrigation canals could be dug to bring water to fields and settlements during the drier months. Consider the scale of this landscape for a moment. A traveler departing from what would become the great city of Mohenjo-Daro on the Indus and journeying eastward across the plain would pass through a landscape dotted with smaller towns and villages, each seemingly connected by trade routes and communication networks. The journey might take weeks on foot, yet the baked brick architecture would remain consistent, the weight systems for measuring trade goods would remain standardized, and the general organization of streets and drainage systems would follow recognizable patterns. How did such consistency emerge across such a vast territory without the presence of a central controlling authority? That question would linger in the minds of scholars for generations, and it remains, in many ways, unanswered. The Ghaggar Hakra system presents a particular mystery to archaeologists, for this river, that once sustained perhaps equal numbers of settlements, has largely vanished from the landscape. Whether it dried due to tectonic shifts, climate change, or the capture of its waters by tributaries flowing to other river systems remains debated among scholars. What is certain is that this river played a crucial role in the civilization's development and prosperity, and its eventual decline would correlate with significant changes in settlement patterns and, ultimately, with the civilization's transformation and dispersal. The geography itself, then, tells part of the story. This was a civilization that arose in a landscape of periodic plenty and periodic crisis, where the rivers were generous but demanding, where the scale was vast but the connections were intimate. The people chose to spread across this entire plain, creating not one great capital, but many interlinked cities, towns, and villages. They learned to read the river's moods, to anticipate the seasons, and to organize themselves in ways that allowed a relatively small number of overseeing administrators, if indeed there were any at all, to maintain order across such enormous distances. Before the grid streets of Mohenjo-Daro rose with their austere perfection, before the carefully laid bricks and covered drains spoke of urban planning, there was a place called Mehrgarh, nestled in what is now Balochistan, in the foothills that gently slope down from the highlands toward the Indus plain. And it is here, in the dust of Mehrgarh, that we must begin if we wish to understand how a civilization came to hold 40,000 souls in harmony. The story does not begin with cities. It begins, as so many stories do, with people deciding to stay. For millennia before Mehrgarh took root, humans had wandered these river valleys and highlands, following the seasons as hunters and gatherers do, moving where the animals moved, where the plants ripened. But somewhere around 9,000 years ago, a moment almost inconceivably distant, yet preserved in layers of earth, something shifted. Perhaps it was a slowly warming climate. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated knowledge that certain grains could be coaxed from soil. Perhaps it was a gathering place so abundant, so naturally generous, that a group decided not to leave when autumn came. We cannot know the exact impulse, but we can trace its consequence in the remains of Mehrgarh. What the archaeologists uncovered there was something quiet, something unremarkable on its face, yet profound in its implications. Not a palace, not a temple or tomb, not a monument to any ruler's ambition. Instead, they found simple mud brick structures, small dwellings clustered together and scattered across the settlement floors, the evidence of a radical experiment, the deliberate cultivation of wheat and barley. Bones of domesticated goats and sheep lay alongside the remains of those early crops, suggesting that the inhabitants had begun the long process of controlling, rather than simply hunting, their food. This transition, from following the herds to tending them, from gathering wild grain to planting seeds and waiting for harvest, is one of humanity's most consequential turns. Yet Mehrgarh did not shout about it. There were no grand ceremonies carved in stone. There was only the quiet labor of tending and building, season after season, year after year, the slow accretion of settled life. For roughly 1,000 years, Mehrgarh remained small, its population modest, its structures humble. But something remarkable was occurring within those simple walls. As people remained in one place, they began to accumulate. Not wealth in the sense of grand treasures, not yet, but knowledge. How to store grain so it would not rot. How to improve the yield of a field. How to trade surplus barley with distant settlements for something one could not easily make oneself. The skeleton of civilization was beginning to articulate itself, bone by bone. By around 7,000 years ago, Mehrgarh had grown. The structures became larger, more substantial. The mud bricks began to be fired in kilns, growing harder and more durable. Pottery appeared in greater variety and sophistication, painted with geometric patterns that suggest not mere utility, but aesthetic intention. A desire to make something beautiful as well as functional. These are small details, perhaps, yet they whisper of something essential. People had begun to think about the future. They built in materials that would last. They decorated objects that would be used by others, or passed down. There was a sense now of community, extending beyond the immediate present moment. And as Mehrgarh grew, so did its connections. Archaeological evidence, trade goods, distinctive pottery styles, suggests that Mehrgarh was not isolated. It was in contact with other settlements, pushing up from the river valleys below, with distant communities in the mountains beyond. Trade routes were forming, routes that would eventually become the arteries of a vast civilization. But in these early centuries, these connections were still tenuous, still fragile. One settlement might influence another, but there was no unified whole, no master hand directing the process. What is perhaps most striking about this period And what becomes increasingly clear as we follow Mehrgar's development into the next 1,000 years is the absence of dramatic rupture. There was no conquest. No foreign power came down from the mountains and imposed order. Instead, there was a kind of patient consolidation. Settlements grew near one another. Some became larger and more prosperous. Certain villages seemed to take on slight prominence, perhaps because of their position on trade routes, or because their fields were particularly fertile. But this was organic growth, driven by practical needs and gradual innovation, not by the will of a supreme authority. By 6,000 years ago, the character of habitation in the Indus region had shifted noticeably. Mehrgar continued, but it was no longer the only story worth telling. Across the river valleys and plains, other sites were growing. Kot Diji emerged with more sophisticated architecture. Amri developed distinctive pottery and stronger defensive positions. Trade networks that had been gossamer thin were becoming more robust. Standardization began to appear. Tools of similar design, weights that were beginning to follow consistent ratios, pottery that suggested not just local exchange but regular, predictable commerce across distances. Here is where the picture becomes particularly intriguing. The transition from these early villages to the urban centers that would eventually flourish did not follow the pattern that one might expect from studying most ancient civilizations. There was no moment, so far as we can discern, when a great king rose up and declared that a city would be built. There was no pharaoh, no emperor overseeing a massive labor force. Instead, what we observe is something far more patient and distributed. Small improvements in agricultural technique meant more food. More food allowed larger populations. Larger populations required new forms of organization, shared granaries, communal wells, systems for storing and distributing surplus. These practical necessities seem to have driven architectural and social innovation far more than any grand vision or despotic mandate. The period spanning from roughly 4,500 to 4,000 years ago witnessed what archaeologists sometimes call the early Harappan phase, a time when the scattered settlements of the Indus Valley were becoming more coordinated, more consciously linked. It was as if dozens of small communities, each solving similar problems: how to manage floods, how to store grain, how to trade with neighbors, had gradually begun to share solutions. A particularly effective drainage system in one settlement might be adopted by another. A standardized weight system that made trade easier might spread across a region. Brick sizes that proved most durable and easy to work with became conventional. This process, the slow, accumulated evolution from dispersed farming villages to coordinated urban settlements, is difficult to narrate with the drama that history books often demand. There are no pivotal battles, no magnificent temples suddenly rising from the plain, no priests making pronouncements. And yet, if we listen carefully to what the earth itself has preserved, we can hear in it something perhaps more remarkable. The story of a people gradually learning to live together in increasing numbers, solving problems through shared innovation rather than imposed authority. By the time we approach the great threshold when Mohenjo-daro and Harappa would emerge as the twin giants of this civilization, thousands of years of steady, patient development had already laid the groundwork. The people of Mehrgar, and of countless other small settlements, had taught their descendants how to cooperate on a larger scale, how to maintain standards across distance, how to trade and store and plan. They had not known that they were building the foundation for something extraordinary. They had only known, season after season, how to cultivate their fields, improve their craft, and include a stranger in the circle of exchange. And from that quiet persistence, something unprecedented would grow. By the time we move deeper into the third millennium before the Common Era, something profound and gradual is unfolding across the Indus plains. The scattered villages that had grown from those first farming settlements are beginning to draw together, to organize, to build with intention. There is no sudden flourish, no decree from a distant palace, no conquest that binds them into a single vision. Instead, what we see is something far quieter and stranger, a slow, almost inevitable gathering of communities into larger centers, each following patterns that seem to mirror the others, yet each independent in its own way. The settlements that emerged during this transitional period, roughly between 4,000 and 3,800 years ago, show all the hallmarks of towns awakening to coordination. Walls appear, but they are not the defensive ramparts of kingdoms fighting for dominance. Drains are dug with foresight. Storage facilities grow. Trade goods accumulate. Yet when archaeologists search the ruins for the tokens of centralized power that we have come to expect in other ancient civilizations, a royal palace, a temple dedicated to a single god-king, evidence of a hereditary ruling class, they find themselves in the presence of an extraordinary silence. Imagine, if you will, a world of perhaps 5,000 separate communities across the river valleys and plains, ranging from modest villages of a few hundred souls to bustling towns housing several thousand. Rather than coalescing around one supreme center, around one city that commanded all others, the Indus Valley seems instead to develop as a constellation of near equals. Balakot, Amri, Kot Diji, Banawali, Kalibangan, each takes its turn as a prospering center. Each shows signs of economic vitality and social organization, and yet none emerges as the undisputed capital, the heart from which all authority radiates outward. What we detect in the archaeological record is something closer to a network than a hierarchy. The repeated brick sizes found from the coast to the interior suggest a shared standard, perhaps agreed upon for trade, for ease of construction, for the movement of goods. The similar pottery styles appearing in widely separated sites point to shared tastes, shared knowledge, shared cultural memory, but not necessarily shared rule. Is this not itself a kind of governance? A civilization that organized itself through consent rather than coercion, through mutual interest rather than fear. The proto-urban period shows us towns growing up independently in different regions, each responding to local geography and opportunity. In the south, communities settled near the Indus and its branches, taking advantage of seasonal flooding and the rich silt deposits. To the east, where the Gagar-Hakra rivers flowed, other towns rose following the water. In the northwest, towards the Sutlej Valley, smaller centers flourished. And yet, and this remains one of the great puzzles, all of these places seem to have arrived at similar solutions to similar problems. They build with baked brick. They create standardized measures for trade. They organize their streets according to cardinal directions. They construct systems for managing water. None of this required a central authority to issue instructions. Perhaps it required only observation, communication, and a shared understanding of what works. This absence of a single dominant capital distinguishes the Indus civilization from nearly every other ancient urban culture. In Egypt, Memphis and later Thebes stood as the living heart of pharaonic power, the seat of the god-king, the nexus through which all resources flowed. In Mesopotamia, cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Babylon rose and fell, each struggling for supremacy, each producing warlords who built ziggurats to touch heaven itself. But here, in the Indus Valley, as the proto-urban phase ripens into the mature Indus civilization, we find something different. We find multiplicity. We find distributed authority. We find what might even be called, in the gentlest sense, a kind of democracy in the arrangement of cities, if not in their internal governance. The larger centers that emerge from this period, and we are drawing close now to the fully formed civilization, seem to have assumed greater responsibility and perhaps greater prestige, but never dominion. Mohenjo-Daro will grow to encompass perhaps 40,000 inhabitants, the largest city the ancient world has yet seen, and yet it appears to have lived alongside Harappa, 500 miles to the north, as a peer rather than a superior. Both cities have similar layouts, similar civic infrastructure, similar evidence of planning and coordination. Both seem to have served similar functions, centers of trade, of craft production, of ritual life, of storage and redistribution. Yet nowhere is there a trace of one city imposing its will on the other, of conquest, of subjugation. The slow, patient archaeological record suggests that this was not accidental. The Indus Valley people made choices. They chose not to concentrate power in a single figure. They chose to build cities that were similar but not identical, suggesting perhaps that each region maintained a degree of autonomy even as they participated in a larger cultural sphere. They chose to spend their resources on wells and drainage systems and standardized weights, rather than on fortifications and armies. And in making these choices, they created something that survived for nearly 1,000 years, not an empire held together by force, but a civilization held together by something far less visible and far more durable. If you were to walk through the gates of Mohenjo-Daro on a morning when the sun had just begun its slow climb above the plains, what would greet you might seem, at first, almost ordinary, and yet utterly strange. Not a palace, not a temple rising toward heaven, not monuments proclaiming the power of a single ruler. Instead, you would find yourself standing before something far more peculiar to the ancient world, a city laid out in lines, as if drawn by an invisible hand with a straight edge and a compass. The streets ran north and south, then east and west, in a grid so orderly that an archaeologist walking those ruins, more than 4,000 years later, would remark that it resembled the planned cities of modern times. Imagine that precision, that deliberate, patient enforcement of geometric order, emerging from the minds of people who left us no written records we can easily read, no royal inscriptions boasting of their achievements. The very planning itself becomes a kind of whisper about who these people were. Someone, somewhere, was thinking about space, about efficiency, about the movement of people and goods through the city in a way that transcended the whims of any single powerful individual. The baked brick. This is where you would notice the true obsession of the Indus Valley builders. They had standardized their bricks with an almost religious precision. The ratio was always there, length to width to height, consistent across the city, consistent across the region, consistent across centuries. A brick made in one part of the Indus Valley could fit seamlessly into a structure built in another part hundreds of miles away. Does this not suggest something profound about coordination, about shared agreement on what things ought to be? In other ancient civilizations, bricks varied. They were made by local craftspeople following local custom and local expedients. But here, across an area the size of modern France or a substantial portion of the United States, the bricks spoke a unified language. The buildings themselves were not grand or soaring. They were practical, rectangular, built with the brick laid in what modern builders call a Flemish bond, alternating headers and stretchers, which gave the walls both strength and stability. The mortar between was gypsum and mud, applied with a precision that would have required patience and skill. The walls, once constructed, were often coated with a lime plaster that would have brightened the city, making it gleam almost white beneath the harsh sun of the Indus plain. Can you imagine the sensory experience of that? Walking through corridors and courtyards where the reflection of light off whitewashed brick would have been both practical, helping to keep the buildings cooler, and perhaps aesthetically pleasing to the eye? But perhaps the most remarkable feature, and the one that speaks most clearly to the minds that governed this civilization, was hidden beneath the streets, the sewers, the covered drains. Small channels, lined and capped with brick or stone, ran beneath the buildings and streets of Mohenjo-Daro, carrying wastewater away from where people lived and worked. Most of the ancient world, at this time, had no such systems. Waste accumulated in the streets. Disease and filth were simply the conditions of urban life. But the Indus Valley people had engineered something different. The drains connected from individual houses, from the bathing areas, from the communal spaces, and they converged into larger channels that carried everything away from the city proper. Some of these drains had inspection points, small openings where someone could, if necessary, clear a blockage or check the flow. Others fed into what appears to have been a sophisticated system of settling tanks, where solids could separate from liquids before the water was released into the river or spread across the fields. This is not the work of a casual or careless people. This is the work of a civilization that had thought deeply about the relationship between human habitation and human waste, about the conditions necessary for a large population to live together without succumbing to the diseases that breed in filth and decay. Walk through Mohenjo-Daro, and you find no great distinction between the homes of the wealthy and the homes of the poor. Or rather, you find some variation in size, but not the kind of hierarchical separation you would expect in other ancient cities. There are larger houses, it is true, but they sit alongside smaller ones, and the division is not so stark as to suggest a rigid class system. The grid itself, laid out with such care, meant that everyone moved through the same planned space, followed the same basic rules about how a city ought to be organized. In that organization lies a kind of equality, or at least an absence of the ostentatious inequality that defined most of the ancient world. The streets were not paved, as far as the evidence shows, but rather left as packed earth, with gutters running down the centers or edges to carry rainwater away during the monsoon season. The city was built on a mound, allowing for some natural drainage, some flowing away of excess water back toward the river or into the surrounding land. Every feature of the layout, every choice about where to place a building or how to orient a street, reflected an accommodation to the climate, to the river, to the practical needs of living in that particular place at that particular time. There were public wells scattered throughout the city, their mouths surrounded by steps so that people could descend safely to draw water in the dry season when the river ran lower. Some of these wells were clearly communal spaces, perhaps gathering places for conversation and exchange. One well, found in the eastern part of the city, is notable for its construction, an octagonal design, carefully engineered to withstand pressure and use. How many hands touched the rim of that well? How many voices echoed in that space? In its silence now, it holds a kind of presence, a sense of people returning again and again to the same spot, the same action, day after day, season after season, century after century. The so-called Great Bath, a rectangular pool surrounded by a colonnade, sits on one of the elevated mounds. Its walls were waterproofed with bitumen, a substance imported from distant sources, and stairs descended from all sides into the water itself. Was it for ritual bathing, for leisure, for ceremonial purposes connected to religious life? The answer remains wrapped in the silence of the ruins. But the sheer care taken in its construction, the waterproofing, the attention to detail, suggests that water itself was sacred, or at least central to whatever social or religious life animated this place. What strikes you as you wander through Mohenjo-Daro is not the presence of monuments or the proclamation of power, but rather the presence of thought, care, the application of collective reasoning to the problem of how to house many thousands of people in a space that is both functional and coherent. It is, in many ways, the opposite of what archaeology had trained its students to look for in ancient cities. And yet, here it was, a city without a king's palace, a city without a temple as its focal point, a city organized around the practical needs of its inhabitants, around the circulation of water and waste, around the equal distribution of access to communal resources. What does such an arrangement tell us about the values of the people who built it? What priorities must they have held to design a city in this way, rather than crowning it with a monument to their ruler's glory? And so we drift from the southern heart of Mohenjo-Daro northeastward along the Indus, traveling perhaps 300 kilometers through a landscape that would have been far greener then, more generous with water, more alive with the sound of commerce and craft. The river itself was different in those ancient days, wider, more temperate in its moods, and it brought traders and settlements both upstream and downstream in a kind of cultural circulation. It was along this network that Harappa rose, and when we speak of Harappa, we are speaking of something architecturally distinct from its great contemporary to the south, yet speaking the same language of brick and geometry and order. Harappa announced itself to early archaeologists not as a single unified settlement, but as two great mounds separated by a floodplain channel. Two hills, really, each containing the compressed remains of neighborhoods, workshops, and administrative spaces, layered upon one another through centuries of habitation. The site, when first explored in the 19th century, had already been partially quarried by engineers seeking ancient bricks for railway beds, a cruel irony of industrial progress, dismantling the very record it was about to help preserve. But enough remained to tell us something profound about how this civilization had ordered itself. At the heart of the Western Mound rose granary structures of breathtaking sophistication. We can still trace their footprints in the archaeology, massive rectangular platforms, carefully aligned, their foundations sunk into the earth with deliberate precision. These were not mere storage silos, nor simple warehouses. They were engineered to allow air circulation, to protect grain from moisture and pests, to manage the surplus that a city of such size required. Ramps led up to loading platforms. The architecture itself speaks of a society that understood logistics, that had learned through trial and error how to preserve the harvest across seasons, to buffer against scarcity. Someone had to design these structures. Someone had to decide where they would stand, how many would be built, how they would be maintained. Yet no inscription tells us the name of that architect. No seal identifies the administrator who commissioned them. And here, we encounter one of the most striking and quietly astonishing facts about the Indus civilization, something that whispers rather than shouts, yet speaks volumes about the nature of this world. The bricks, the fundamental building blocks of both Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, and the hundreds of smaller settlements scattered across the plain, were standardized, not approximately standardized, not close enough for practical purposes, but standardized to a degree that seems almost obsessive to our modern sensibilities. The proportions, the length, width, and height of a baked brick, maintained consistent ratios across a territory that stretched from what is now Pakistan to the borders of India, a distance of over 1,500 kilometers. How is such uniformity achieved without a central authority mandating specifications? How does a civilization maintain such consistency across generations, across centuries, across the rise and fall of individual cities? There are several possibilities that gently emerge from the archaeological record, each one raising new questions. Perhaps there was a guild system, a confederation of master bricklayers who had sworn oaths to maintain traditional proportions, passing the knowledge from father to son, apprentice to master, in an unbroken chain. Perhaps there was a weight-based system. Some scholars have suggested that Indus bricks, like their weights and measures, were calculated using standardized units that derived from a common mathematical principle. If everyone worked from the same units of measurement, then bricks made in Harappa would fit seamlessly with bricks made in Mohenjo-Daro. But to maintain that across so many generations, across so many hands, suggests something more than mere practical necessity. It suggests a shared culture of standards, a deep commitment to order. The granaries at Harappa were built from these standardized bricks. The streets were laid out using them. The wells, the drainage systems, the walls of homes and workshops, all followed from this single decision, made somewhere in the distant past, to normalize the brick. It allowed for predictability. A mason knew that a brick made by a craftsman 200 kilometers away would be the same size as one made in his own yard. It meant that construction techniques could be shared, refined, improved, without confusion or waste. It meant that repairs could be made by any skilled worker, anywhere in the civilization. But it also hints at something else, something more philosophical. It suggests a people who valued consistency, not merely for practical efficiency, but perhaps for aesthetic reasons, for a desire to impose order on the world, to create harmony through repetition and proportion. The granaries themselves, when examined more carefully, reveal further complexity. They appear to have been associated with residential quarters, suggesting that administrators or overseers lived in proximity to the stored grain. The labor required to maintain such facilities was considerable. Workers to tend the structures, to prevent decay and spoilage, to manage the flow of grain in and out according to the seasons and the needs of the population. And yet, we find no symbols of oppression, no evidence of forced labor camps or brutal hierarchies. The skeletal remains we have recovered show no unusual patterns of violence, no signs of a slave population worked to death or beaten into submission. The workers, whoever they were, seemed to have been part of the broader community, eating the same foods, living in comparable houses, subject to the same civic structures as everyone else. This is the mystery that deepens as we examine Harappa more closely. The standardization of bricks, the engineering of granaries, the organization of labor and resources, all of this speaks to a civilization with sophisticated administrative machinery. Yet that machinery left virtually no trace of a king, no palace, no royal inscriptions proclaiming conquest or divine right. The people of Harappa, it seems, had decided that order could be maintained through other means. The streets of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, when we allow ourselves to imagine them, must have been filled with a quiet industry, not the clamor of conquest or the fanfare of kings, but something gentler, steadier, the patient work of hands shaping the world into usefulness. Picture, if you will, the potter's quarter on the eastern edge of the city, where the air would have hung thick with clay dust and the smell of fired brick. The craftspeople there, and we know from archaeological evidence that they were many, would have worked with a precision that speaks of deep tradition, of knowledge passed down through generations like a cherished song. Each vessel bears the mark of this care, even the most mundane storage jar, shaped to hold grain or water, with a subtle balance that suggests the maker understood not just how to fashion clay, but how it would rest in a home. The potter was not alone in this careful work. Throughout the cities, in workshops that opened directly onto the streets, sculptors worked small seals from steatite stone, carving them with tools of bronze and stone, their hands moving in motions so practiced that they could almost complete a seal with their eyes closed. Each tiny rectangle, no larger than a thumbnail, would receive an animal image or geometric pattern, pressed so deeply and with such care that we, thousands of years later, can still read the impression perfectly. Why such precision for something so small? Perhaps because these seals held meaning beyond their size. They may have marked ownership, confirmed trade agreements, or carried messages between distant merchants. The seal carver's work was quiet work, solitary work, the kind that rewards patience and a steady hand. In the bead workshops, which we believe concentrated particularly around Harappa, the air would have been different, warmer perhaps, filled with the sound of stone on stone. Carnelian, that warm reddish gem, would have been heated and shaped into the beads that would eventually find their way into the hands of traders bound for Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. The craftspeople who worked these stones would have been specialists, valued members of their households and workshops, their knowledge specific and hard-won. Turquoise, lapis lazuli, brought from distant mountains, shell from the coast, all were shaped here into objects of beauty and, we suspect, of considerable economic worth. Each bead represents hours of work, a kind of labor that suggests the cities had developed both the surplus of resources and the social organization necessary to support artisans who did nothing but this, day after day. What about the weavers? The cotton of the Indus Valley became legendary in the ancient world, and the evidence suggests that the production of cotton cloth was among the most significant industries in these cities. We can only imagine the looms that filled certain quarters, standing in rooms where the air would have been thick with fiber, and the rhythmic beating of the weaver's tools. The finished cloth would have been both for local use and for trade, rolled and bound, ready to travel on boats down the river or across overland routes to other civilizations. A weaver's hands would have become strong from this work, their fingers precise, their eyes attuned to the subtle irregularities in weave that made the difference between adequate and excellent. But what of the daily life beyond the workshops? What of the people who were not specialized artisans? Here we must move with care, acknowledging that we are imagining, though we imagine from evidence. The houses of Mohenjo-daro, arranged in neat blocks with streets running north and south, east and west, suggest a population that lived in considerable comfort compared to their contemporaries elsewhere in the world. The average house had an interior courtyard, and from these courtyards, we can infer something about family life and the work that happened within homes. Women may have ground grain on stone querns, a task that would have filled many hours of the day, the repetitive motion meditative in its own way. Children would have played in these courtyards while tasks were accomplished around them, learning through observation the skills they would need as adults. Can you imagine the patience required to teach a child to navigate these cities, with their intricate street systems and the careful observance of social space? The communal wells scattered throughout the cities provided more than water. They provided gathering places. At dawn and in the evening, the streets leading to these wells would have filled with people carrying vessels, meeting and greeting, exchanging news and information. The well was not merely a functional necessity, but a social center, a place where different households intersected, where children might play while adults filled their water vessels, where rumors about distant trade or concerns about the approaching flood season would have been shared. The wells themselves were often elevated, with brick-lined chambers and steps descending to the water below, suggesting a level of engineering concern for maintaining clean water that speaks to the health consciousness of the population. And then there is the Great Bath, that remarkable structure at Mohenjo-Daro that remains one of the most evocative spaces we can visit today. The excavated remains reveal a carefully constructed pool, approached by stairs on multiple sides, with a water system that would have filled it from one direction and drained it in the opposite, keeping it fresh and clean. The walls around it suggest it was not an open plaza, but a covered or partially covered space, private in its own way, or at least controlled in terms of access. Was this a ceremonial space where ritual bathing took place? Was it a public bath where citizens could cleanse themselves? The evidence suggests both may be true. The careful construction, the standardized nature of the brickwork, the sophistication of the water system, all point to the fact that this space held significance beyond the merely practical. Perhaps bathing was understood as a ritual act, a daily observance that connected individuals to something larger than themselves, to practices that would have marked them as members of this particular civilization. The water systems throughout these cities reveal something profound about daily life. The covered drains that run beneath the streets, the public bathrooms that appear to have existed in various districts, the wells positioned at regular intervals, all suggest that access to clean water and the management of waste were understood as collective concerns. Individual houses had latrines, many of them connected to underground drains that moved water away from living spaces with a care that would not be seen again in many parts of the world for thousands of years. This systematic attention to sanitation speaks to a civilization that was concerned with the health of its population, that had developed the infrastructure and social agreements necessary to maintain it. Picture the courtyards again, this time filled with the particular sounds and smells of daily life. The smoke from cooking fires would have drifted upward, carrying the scent of whatever meals were being prepared, perhaps lentils, perhaps fish from the river, perhaps grain cakes cooked on stone. The sound of children's voices, perhaps the cry of a seller of goods moving through the street, the rhythm of looms, or the tap of hammers from the workshops. In the evening, as the sun moved lower and the heat of the day began to release its grip, perhaps people would have emerged from within their houses to spend time in courtyards and on streets, socializing as the temperature became more bearable. The day would have had a rhythm to it, shaped by heat and work, by the presence of others, by the particular rhythms of this civilization that we are only beginning to understand. In every known great city of the ancient world, there stands a palace, a throne room where power collects, where the word of a single man, or sometimes a woman, shapes the lives of thousands below. Mesopotamia had its kings in ziggurats, Egypt its pharaohs in limestone tombs, the Yellow River civilizations their dynasts commanding from walled courts. Yet in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, in all the silent streets and carefully measured blocks of the Indus Valley, archaeologists found something that still puzzles us: an absence. No palace has ever been definitively identified, no throne, no royal seal bearing the name of a conquering monarch, no palace guards or royal treasury. The greatest cities of their age seem to have been ruled, if ruled they were, by no one person at all. This absence speaks louder than presence. It whispers of a way of organizing human life, of making collective decisions, of sharing resources, of settling disputes, that we have almost forgotten how to imagine. Not because it was primitive or accidental, but because it was utterly unlike the path that most civilizations would choose, and so the world largely left it behind. What, then, shaped the construction of a grid-planned city housing 40,000 souls? What authority determined that drainage systems should run beneath every street, that brick sizes should remain standardized from the Arabian Sea to the foothills? What voice, or voices, could command such coordination across hundreds of settlements without leaving us their names carved in stone? Scholars have offered several theories, each one incomplete, each one speaking to a different possibility. Perhaps the first and most tantalizing is that of shared civic governance, something closer to a council or assembly than a kingdom. Imagine the early merchants and craftsmen, the landowners and the heads of important families, gathering in some central space we have not yet found, or that has crumbled beyond recognition. These men, and possibly women, might have met regularly to decide matters of trade regulation, of water rights during the flood season, of standards and measurements. Not democracy as we understand it, with individual votes and written laws posted in the marketplace, but something more organic, a meeting of the substantial families, the keepers of trade secrets, the guardians of craft traditions, reaching consensus through discussion and mutual interest. Such councils are not uncommon in early civilizations, and they often leave lighter traces in the archaeological record than kings do. A council leaves no palace, no tomb, no inscriptions proclaiming victory. It leaves only the evidence of its collective will, the ordered streets, the public works, the shared standards. The second theory, closely related, is that of merchant guilds wielding authority not through law, but through economic power and mutual agreement. The Indus Valley civilization, as we shall discover, was a civilization of traders. Its people moved goods across vast distances, maintained contact with distant lands, understood weights and measurements with remarkable precision. Perhaps authority lay not in the hands of hereditary kings, but in the hands of these merchant families, each controlling a particular trade: the seal makers, the bead carvers, the cotton merchants, the traders in lapis lazuli. These families might have formed something like a loose confederation, each powerful within their domain, bound together by the necessity of maintaining order and standards so that trade could flourish. A guild system like this would explain the remarkable uniformity across such distances. The merchants had an interest in standardization. A brick that was the correct size in Harappa would fit the architectural plans of Mohenjo-Daro. A weight system that was honest would be trusted from the Indus to Mesopotamia. Trade depends on such trust, on shared understanding, on the confidence that a measure in one place means the same as a measure in another. But perhaps authority was even more distributed than this. Perhaps it was diffuse throughout communities themselves, embedded in religious practice, in ritual obligation, in the social weight of tradition. Many societies have been held together not by coercive force, but by shared belief and communal participation in regular observances. The Indus Valley people seem to have bathed regularly, communally, in wells and in that great rectangular pool we call the Great Bath. These were not merely hygienic practices, but likely held ritual significance, moments when the community gathered and reaffirmed its bonds. If authority derived from such communal practices, from the shared performance of ritual, from the collective maintenance of standards through social pressure rather than the threat of punishment, then governance would leave very few traces indeed. No palace to excavate, no throne to photograph, no administrative documents recording the ruler's decrees. Only the quiet orderliness that comes from communities that understand their place in a larger whole. There is also a quieter, sadder possibility that some scholars voice hesitantly, that the absence of evidence for centralized power does not necessarily mean that power was shared equally, but rather that it was exercised in ways that did not require monuments, palaces, or the violent assertion of hierarchy. Perhaps there were elites, families of considerable wealth and status, but their authority was maintained through economic control and social custom, rather than through military force or the visible trappings of monarchy. Subtle domination can be as effective as overt displays of power, sometimes more so. The wealthy merchant family that controls the supply of a crucial good, that determines who has access to trade networks and who does not, that can reward loyalty and punish defiance through economic leverage alone. Such a family exercises real power without needing to build a palace or commission a statue. The streets would remain orderly, the standards maintained, the civilization functioning, all without the ostentatious display that made other ancient rulers feel the need to carve their names into everything. And then there is the thought that emerges from sitting with the evidence itself, from looking at a map of the Indus Valley civilization, with its hundreds of settlements of varying sizes, many of them organized in a similar fashion, but no single one clearly dominating. Perhaps there was no unified system of governance at all. Perhaps what we are looking at is a collection of semi-autonomous towns and trade communities, each with its own local authority, maybe a council, maybe an assembly of merchants, maybe the hereditary head of the most prominent family, bound together not by submission to a central power, but by shared culture, shared standards, shared religious practices. A loose confederation of the willing, maintaining contact and trade and mutual respect without the need for a central authority to enforce order. The surprising thing is not that such a system existed, but that it seems to have worked so well, creating such uniform, planned cities without anybody issuing orders from above. All of these theories remain incomplete. None of them can be proven from the evidence we have. But together they open a door onto a way of thinking about civilization that most of us have never seriously entertained. They suggest that the complex organization of large human communities, the building of beautiful cities, the coordination of trade across thousands of miles, the maintenance of standards and the creation of order, these things do not require kings. They do not require the concentration of power in the hands of a few. They do not require armies or fortifications, or the elaborate apparatus of hierarchical control that we have assumed for so long to be necessary. What authority then shaped these cities? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, but what we can see, what the evidence gently suggests, is that human beings were here, in the Indus Valley, learning to live together without the need to bow before a throne. Yet even in their stillness, the cities of the Indus were not isolated. Across the deserts and along the seacoasts, goods moved, merchants traveled. And the evidence of this reaches us still, embedded in clay, in stone, in the weight of a single bead. The Arabian Sea cradled the Indus Valley on its western flank, and from those harbors, perhaps at Lothal in the south, or along the coastal settlements whose names we have forgotten, boats carried cargo outward, toward Mesopotamia, toward the Persian Gulf, toward the Oman Peninsula, and the coasts of what we now call Bahrain. The Indus Valley did not exist in isolation. It existed in conversation. Archaeologists have found the proof of this exchange scattered across both lands. In the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, they have discovered objects that could have come from nowhere else. Small, exquisitely carved seals, their rectangular faces covered in that undeciphered script, their purposes still mysterious. Carnelian beads, lapis lazuli worked in the Indus way. These were not curiosities, not rarities brought back by a single adventurous trader. They appear repeatedly across centuries, suggesting not isolated contact, but steady, predictable trade. The seals themselves are remarkable to contemplate in the dark hours when the mind drifts towards such things. They are small enough to rest on your palm, perhaps the size of a thumb's width on each side, carved from stone, chalcedony, steatite, sometimes even faience. On one side, an inscription in that script that still defies us. On the other, an image, a unicorn horn rising above a crescent, a buffalo with enormous horns, three-legged animals, sometimes a figure that might be human, in postures of reverence or offering. These seals were not mere decoration. They were, most likely, stamps for clay, marks of ownership perhaps, or certification of goods. A merchant pressing his seal into clay as a guarantee, a promise, a signature written in the language of objects rather than words. And if we pause to consider what this means, it suggests that whoever controlled trade in the Indus Valley understood the value of standardization. They understood that a seal meant something to a Mesopotamian merchant, that a repeated image, a repeated mark, created trust across distances that would take weeks or months to traverse. This was not primitive trade. This was commerce, built on reputation and recognition. The carnelian beads are perhaps easier to imagine in our mind's eye. Picture them, small and glowing red-orange in lamplight, each one drilled through its center so it could be strung with others. The Indus Valley became famous for these beads. The geological deposits of carnelian lay within the region, and the craftspeople there refined a technique for cutting and polishing that made their beads distinctive, finer, more prized. In Mesopotamian sites, carnelian beads appear in burial contexts, in temples, in the graves of the wealthy. They had traveled as objects of genuine value, not as cheap trinkets but as luxuries worth hoarding. But the trade ran both directions. The Indus received goods from the West as well. Evidence of Mesopotamian cylinder seals has been found in Indus sites. Oils, perhaps. Textiles from Bahrain. The exact nature of many exchanges remains opaque. Archaeology cannot always tell us what was exchanged for what, or whether the trade was direct or moved through intermediaries. Perhaps goods changed hands many times before reaching their final destination. Perhaps merchants from the Indus and merchants from Mesopotamia never met face to face. Their transactions, mediated through traders in the Persian Gulf, on the islands of Bahrain or Dilmun, which served as crossroads. And there were other routes, other networks. To the north and northeast, the Indus Valley maintained contact with Central Asia, with the high passes and the plateau lands beyond, where different peoples lived different lives. Lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, from Badakhshan, where the only deposits of true lapis in the ancient world could be found. We know this came into the Indus Valley because we find it worked into beads, into pendants, into objects of clear value. This means there were networks of exchange reaching far up into the mountains. People who crossed those passes regularly enough that stone from High Asia became ordinary enough to work into everyday luxury items. The weights used in Indus commerce tell their own quiet story. Each major settlement seems to have followed a standardized system, cubic weights of stone, often made from limestone or diorite, balanced to precise ratios, one unit to another unit in consistent proportion. This was not accidental. This was deliberate, organized standardization imposed across hundreds of miles of territory. When a merchant arrived at Mohenjo-Daro from Harappa or from Rajasthan, he could trust the weight system. He could conduct business knowing that a pound in one city meant the same as a pound in another. This suggests coordination, perhaps from a central authority, perhaps simply from the accumulated practical wisdom of traders who knew that consistency served everyone's interests. And yet here is the puzzle that deepens the mystery of the Indus Valley's governance. A trading network of this scale, spanning thousands of miles, requiring standardization and some form of agreement across distances. This does not simply emerge. Someone had to establish the weights. Someone had to oversee their consistency. Someone had to enforce the value of a seal from one city in another. The very existence of this trade, the very precision of its mechanisms, suggests a degree of organization, of shared purpose, that we can barely glimpse. A civilization that organized itself, not through the shout of kings, but through the quiet agreement of those who understood that order served profit, that trust was worth more than conquest. These merchants whose names we will never know, whose faces we cannot see, whose languages we do not speak, they moved through the ancient world carrying the Indus Valley with them. Each bead, each sealed bundle of goods, each perfectly weighted stone was a word in a conversation that spanned continents. And that conversation, that steady exchange of objects and value and trust, sustained the cities we now walk through in imagination. It was not a glorious conversation. It was not the stuff of epics or kings' chronicles, but it was profound and enduring and real. Yet alongside these streets and structures, within the dust of every excavated courtyard and pressed into the clay of countless small tablets, there exists something that has eluded us for a century now, the Indus script, a writing system of somewhere between 465 distinct symbols, each one rendered with precision, each one a small door that refuses to open. It appears on seals the size of a thumbnail. It marks pottery shards. It was incised into copper plates and stamped onto terracotta by hands we will never know. And despite the devotion of linguists and archaeologists, despite computer algorithms trained on thousands of inscriptions, despite the collective intellectual effort of generations, the script remains silent. It does not speak to us in any language the modern world can hear. Consider what we know. The symbols are most often found written from right to left, though sometimes they move in a boustrophedon pattern, turning like a plow through a field. Many inscriptions are remarkably brief, a few glyphs, rarely more than 20. This brevity itself is a kind of clue, though to what, nobody can quite say. Were these labels, names, religious invocations, merchant marks? The silence is almost louder than any answer could be. Scholars have tried to read it as Dravidian, the language family that still thrives in southern India today. The logic seemed sound. The Indus civilization and its people may have spoken something ancestral to Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, or Malayalam. Attempts were made to assign phonetic values, to see if the symbols might spell out words that linguists could recognize. But these efforts, while learned and serious, have yielded no consensus, no breakthrough, no moment where the door swung open and meaning flooded through. Others have proposed that the script encodes a language now entirely lost. Perhaps it belonged to the pre-Dravidian peoples of the subcontinent, speakers of something wholly extinct, with no descendants alive to whisper its secrets into modern ears. If this is true, then the script becomes even more unreachable, a language locked in a tomb with no key, no echo, no surviving echo in any living tongue. Some scholars have wondered, almost hesitantly, if the writing system might not represent language at all in the way we typically understand it. What if the symbols were a form of proto-writing, similar to early logosyllabic systems in Mesopotamia? What if they signified primarily meaning rather than sound, like the way a symbol can communicate an idea before it becomes a word? This possibility opens a strange and quieter kind of interpretation. It would mean the Indus people communicated through images and signs, rather than the sequential utterance of phonemes we associate with alphabetic writing. It would mean their system was fundamentally different from the ones that came after it. The computer scientists have had their turn as well. Sophisticated artificial intelligence and pattern recognition systems have been trained on the corpus of known inscriptions. The hope was that by finding statistical patterns, mathematical relationships between symbols, perhaps even the way symbols cluster together across thousands of examples, the machine might detect something human eyes have missed. And machines have indeed found patterns. But patterns are not meaning. A pattern can be beautiful and regular without speaking anything we can understand. It is the difference between a well-made wall and a written word. There is something almost poignant about this resistance. Here is a civilization that built cities of planned precision, that standardized brick sizes across 1,000 kilometers, that established weight systems for commerce, and maintained them with apparent rigor. Yet their voices remain muffled, they wrote. They made marks with purpose and care, but we have inherited only the marks without the sound. What makes this silence perhaps more affecting is that we do not even know with certainty what the script's purpose was in their society. How many people could read? Was writing a skill of a small scribal class, as it was in early Mesopotamia? Or could a broader population engage with the written word? Were the inscriptions meant for record-keeping, for spiritual practice, for marking ownership or origin? We see the evidence without understanding its function. We have the alphabet without the grammar. Attempts continue, of course. New excavations have occasionally yielded longer inscriptions or variants that scholars hoped might hold the key. The Rosetta Stone, that miraculous artifact that allowed Champollion to finally read Egyptian hieroglyphics, has become a kind of mythic reference point in Indus studies. Perhaps another such stone lies buried, waiting to be found, inscribed in both the Indus script and some known language. Perhaps the answer is in the earth, patient, dormant, as all buried things are. Or perhaps we will never know. Perhaps the Indus Valley chose to keep something of itself private, hidden from the reach of centuries yet to come. The inability to read does not negate what we learn from what remains unread. The seals themselves are beautiful objects. The animals they depict, the unicorn-horned creature, the rhinoceros, the water buffalo, are rendered with observation and grace. The human figures and ritual scenes inscribed beside them suggest spiritual complexity, hierarchies of meaning, stories that mattered deeply to people whose names we will never know. In a strange way, the mystery becomes another kind of teaching. It reminds us that not all knowledge can be forced into light. Some things whisper from behind a veil, and the veil itself becomes part of what we know. Within the silence of these ancient cities lies another kind of evidence, not of what was said aloud, but of what was believed, what was feared, what was held sacred. The people of the Indus left us their seals, small, squared pieces of steatite stone, each one pressed into clay or perhaps into wax, each one bearing an image that we can see, but whose meaning still eludes us, drifting just beyond the reach of certainty, like smoke rising from an evening fire. On these seals, animals appear with striking frequency. The rhinoceros, bold and territorial. The tiger, striped and watchful. The elephant, massive and serene. The bull, sometimes depicted with unusual emphasis, as if it held a significance that went beyond mere herding or commerce. What did these creatures mean to them? We can only sense our way forward, touch the surface of a belief system we cannot fully enter. One seal in particular has drawn the careful speculation of those who study these remains. It shows a figure seated in a posture of profound meditation, cross-legged, knees drawn apart in a way that suggests deliberate, intentional stillness. Around this figure, animals seem to gather, a buffalo, an antelope, a tiger, perhaps a rhinoceros. The figure itself appears to wear a headdress or horns, something that rises from the crown. Some scholars have wondered, quietly, whether this might be an ancestor or prototype of what much later Hindu traditions would call Shiva, the lord of yoga, of ascetics, of the wild places where animals roam. But we must be careful here. We cannot know. We can only notice the resonance, the echoes across millennia, the way certain forms persist in the human imagination. The seals, you see, are not quite pictures. They are more like signatures, each one unique in its details, yet following a repeating grammar. A figure, often a deity, or being of unusual power, an animal. Sometimes a phrase in that undeciphered script running along one edge, as if names were being pronounced to witnesses who no longer live. They were likely used to mark ownership, to seal contracts, to authenticate transactions in the dense marketplace of trade that moved goods across the monsoon routes and the desert trails. But they were also, perhaps, something more, objects that carried meaning beyond utility, vessels for belief. Water appears throughout the symbolic language of this civilization, with a persistence that cannot be coincidental. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, which we passed through earlier in quieter moments, was lined with baked brick and sealed with natural tar brought perhaps from Baluchistan. It was monumental in its care. Not for everyday washing, surely. There were wells for that, smaller basins tucked into private courtyards. This was something ceremonial, something communal. Perhaps the people who lived in these cities understood water not merely as a practical substance, essential for drinking and irrigation, but as something transformative, something that cleansed the inner self as it cleansed the body. In Hindu philosophy, Millennia after the Indus civilization had dispersed and blended into the cultures that would follow, water takes on profound symbolic weight. Ritual bathing before prayer, the sacred rivers, the Indus itself, the Ganges, the Saraswati, understood as goddesses, as pathways to the divine. Did this sensibility originate in these ancient times, in these carefully constructed baths and wells? We cannot say with certainty, but the pattern is there, like a thread running through the tapestry, waiting for someone to pull it gently and see what unravels. The seals show serpents too, snakes coiled or striking, rendered in profile. The serpent appears in later Indian traditions as Ananta, the infinite serpent upon which the cosmos rests, and as the kundalini energy that yogis speak of awakening within the spine. Again, we encounter this problem, this beautiful, haunting problem of forms that appear in the Indus Valley and reappear in traditions thousands of years distant. Are they the same belief, a descendant, a coincidence? The honest answer is that we do not know. We can only acknowledge the echo and sit with the mystery. Trees appear on the seals as well. The peepal tree, possibly. That fig tree whose roots seem to grip the earth with ancient purpose, whose broad leaves catch the monsoon rain. In later traditions, the Buddha would sit beneath a peepal tree and receive enlightenment. Did the Indus Valley people venerate this tree? The seals suggest something worthy of note, something positioned at the center of a seal's composition, sometimes shown with animals approaching it, or human figures touching its branches. A sacred tree, perhaps, a meeting place between the earthly and the numinous. One observation strikes the mind as we consider these images, the absence of hierarchy, even in religious representation. There is no king seated above all other beings. There is no god towering above the animals, dominating them. Instead, the figures seem to coexist, to share the seal's small square space with something approaching equilibrium. The human or semi-divine figure meditates while animals gather. The sacred tree stands central while creatures approach. This sensibility, this idea that divinity might not be hierarchical, that holiness might be distributed across many beings and forms, resonates strangely through the ages. The weight systems used throughout the Indus Valley show remarkable standardization. Weights in the shape of cubes and rectangles, each one precisely calculated to multiples of a base unit. Why did they care so much? Why did they insist on this uniformity across such vast distances? Perhaps it was practical, ensuring honest trade, preventing fraud. But perhaps it was also philosophical. Perhaps there was something in the culture that valued precision, balance, the idea that the world could be measured and ordered according to rational principles. And yet, this ordered, rational civilization had no kings, no palaces, no overt militarism. What kind of mind creates such a thing? As we linger in this realm of symbols and speculation, we move through a landscape of half-seen things. The seals are whispering to us. The water calls to us. The animals look out across 5,000 years with eyes we cannot quite read. What was the inner life of these cities? What prayers were murmured at dawn? What were the children taught about the nature of existence and the beings that shared their world? These questions hang in the warm air like incense smoke, never fully dispersing, never quite settling into certainty. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps a civilization that left us no written histories, no records carved in stone by kings proclaiming their victories, is entitled to keep some secrets. Entitled to remain, in part, a mystery, a mirror in which we see not the truth of what they were, but something of what we wonder and long to understand. What sustained a city of 40,000 bodies, day after day, season after season, for more than 1,000 years? The answer lies not in palaces or armies, but in something far quieter and more profound, in the careful orchestration of water, seed, and animal, in the slow turning of the seasons and the patient hands that shaped the earth itself. The Indus Valley civilization rose not by conquest, but by cultivation. Farmers, many generations before the great cities took their brick and stone form, had already begun the delicate work of bending the river to their will. They understood something fundamental about the Indus that most modern observers still find remarkable, that the river's annual flood, though violent and unpredictable, carried within it the promise of renewal. Each monsoon brought silt, thick and fertile, that would settle across the floodplain like a gift. And those early settlers, living in small hamlets near Mehrgarh 5,000 years before Mohenjo-Daro rose, learned to anticipate this rhythm. They built simple channels, they shaped embankments, they moved water where it needed to go. By the time the great cities emerged, this knowledge had become sophisticated, almost architectural in its precision. The evidence suggests, and here we speak gently, for much remains obscured by time and archaeology, that canal systems of remarkable complexity threaded through the Indus Valley. Not the grand aqueducts of later empires, but networks of smaller channels that ran through the countryside, branching and rejoining like the tributaries of an inland river. Farmers would have opened gates at precise moments to flood their fields. They would have watched the water level, knowing when to close the channels and let the earth drink in the moisture. This was not random flooding. This was learned, refined, passed from father to son across generations. The crops they grew shaped not only survival, but civilization itself: wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. These grains filled the granaries we see at Harappa and elsewhere, great brick structures with ventilation systems that speak to a people who understood how to preserve their abundance for the months when the fields lay dormant. But perhaps more remarkably, the Indus Valley peoples cultivated cotton. In a world where linen from flax and wool from sheep were the dominant fibers, these people discovered how to spin and weave the white bolls of the cotton plant. Seals have been found depicting what may be cotton bolls, and the trade records, the weights of goods, the distances traveled, suggest that Indus Valley cotton moved along routes to Mesopotamia, to the Persian Gulf, and beyond. One can imagine the value of such fabric in the hands of merchants, the prestige of a bolt of soft, absorbent cloth that did not come from flax or sheep, but from a plant that thrived in the warm floodplain. Water, of course, was everything. The rivers provided it in abundance, yes, but abundance itself required management. Gentle reader, consider the engineering task. How does a civilization prevent the very source of its life from destroying it? The Indus, like most major rivers of the subcontinent, swelled with monsoon rains and subsided into leaner months. The flooding could be catastrophic. Entire fields could be swept away. Entire settlements could vanish. Yet the evidence suggests that rather than fleeing to higher ground, the people built with the river in mind. Their cities were situated at elevations carefully chosen, near but not in the path of the worst floods. Their drainage systems, those covered brick conduits that run beneath the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, may have served not only to carry away waste, but to manage sudden surges of water during the monsoon swelling. The domesticated animals tell their own story of sustenance: cattle, zebu with their characteristic humped backs, sheep and goats, pigs. These animals moved through the Indus Valley landscape, not wild but kept, bred, and managed. Seals depict them, sometimes being led, sometimes seemingly venerated. They provided milk and meat, yes, but also labor. Oxen could pull plows, could haul goods from field to city. They could carry loads across the landscape. The bones found in archaeological deposits suggest that meat was eaten, but perhaps not in the abundance we might expect. It is possible that animals held value beyond their flesh, that milk and yogurt and cheese were as important or more so than slaughter itself. Whether this reflected a philosophical restraint, an economic calculation, or simple pragmatism, we cannot say with certainty. Imagine the daily calendar of the valley, farmers waking before dawn to manage the water systems, checking channels, observing the color of the Indus itself, herders moving cattle toward grazing lands, knowing the paths, the seasons, the quality of different pastures, merchants noting the harvest reports coming in from the hinterland, calculating what could be traded, what needed to be stored. In the cities, workers processed these raw materials, grinding grain, spinning cotton, treating hides. The granaries became the heart of urban life, repositories not merely of food, but of social stability, of the covenant between the collective and the individual. If the harvest was good, the granaries would fill. If the harvest failed, the granaries would be opened. This system, this relationship between people and stored abundance, may have been more binding than any king's law. What is striking, as one contemplates the agricultural achievement of the Indus Valley, is its quietness. There are no monuments celebrating great irrigation works. There are no royal inscriptions boasting of canals built or harvests commanded. There is only the careful, methodical evidence in the ground itself, the channels, the granaries, the terracing of fields, the selection and storage of seeds. A civilization sustained itself not through dramatic acts, but through attention, through knowledge passed along, through systems that held themselves in balance. The domestication of plants and animals, the management of water, the careful preservation and redistribution of surplus, these were the true engines of the Indus Valley civilization. Not conquest, not the whip and the throne, but the understanding that life emerges when a people align themselves with the rhythms of river and season, when they learn to give and take with the earth itself, when they build systems that serve not one person but the many. The Indus Valley thrived for over 1,000 years on principles that modernity has largely forgotten. Principles written not in grand monuments, but in the very grain and water and brick that held the civilization together. And yet, when archaeologists first began to piece together the physical world of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, they encountered something that would reshape how we understand what a thriving civilization might look like. Across the excavated cities, across the hundreds of settlements that dotted the Indus floodplain, across 2,000 years of occupation and growth and community life, there are almost no weapons. Not none, but almost none. And this absence, this quiet gap where we might expect to find the instruments of violence that archaeology has trained us to recognize as markers of organized society, this absence begins to whisper something that feels almost unbelievable to modern ears. To understand how unusual this truly is, we might pause for a moment and consider what archaeologists have grown accustomed to finding in other ancient cities of the same era. In the ruins of Mesopotamian settlements, in the fortified towns of early China, in the palace complexes of Minoan Crete, violence leaves its traces everywhere. Weapons are embedded in graves, depicted on wall carvings, integrated into the very architecture of cities, as they bristle with walls and bastions and defensive towers. But walk through what remains of Mohenjo-Daro, and you will not find these signatures. The city has no grand defensive wall. Its structures do not rise into towers designed for archers and sentries. The baked brick buildings cluster together in their neat grid patterns, but they are not arranged to create kill zones or defensive perimeters. There are a few bronze weapons, a handful, scattered across the layers of time and the different mounds where excavations have occurred. But their scarcity is striking enough that it begs a question that sits at the heart of this mystery. Does the absence of weapons point toward a civilization that achieved something we have rarely seen in human history, a large, organized society that maintained itself through internal peace? Or is it simply that we are looking at the wrong evidence, that the weapons have been lost to time, that the violence of this civilization simply left no trace? The first interpretation, the hopeful one, suggests that the Indus civilization developed forms of social cohesion that did not rely on military force. Without kings to wage territorial wars, without armies to enforce the will of a single ruler, perhaps authority emerged from something far more subtle. Perhaps it arose from consensus, from the kind of shared civic responsibility that we can dimly perceive in the standardized brick sizes and the carefully engineered drainage systems that suggest collective agreements about how a city should be built. Perhaps the guilds of craftspeople and the merchant councils that likely governed trade also served to settle disputes, to redistribute resources, to maintain social harmony in a way that made coercive violence unnecessary. And there is something quietly powerful in imagining this. A civilization where disputes were resolved through negotiation, rather than the sword, where a person's status came from their skill, their connections, their reputation as a trader or artisan, rather than from the ability to command warriors, where the maintenance of order came through social pressure, through reputation and kinship ties, through the kinds of bonds that still govern small communities across the world today. Even at a population of 30 or 40,000 in a single city, such mechanisms might have held. But the second interpretation, the more cautious one, asks us to consider whether we might simply be seeing an incomplete record. Weapons could have been made of wood, which decays entirely over millennia. They could have been melted down and reused. They could have been swept away by the very floods that shaped this civilization. And if there were conflicts, they might have left their mark, not in weapons but in the absence of records, in the disruptions visible in the archaeological layers, in the patterns of abandonment that we see in certain settlements but cannot fully explain. There is also a middle ground worth contemplating. Perhaps this civilization experienced internal peace, not because it had transcended human nature or discovered some secret formula for harmony, but because the conditions of life in the Indus Valley, at least during its flourishing centuries, simply did not create the intense competition and resource scarcity that so often trigger organized violence. The river was generous. Trade was profitable. The environment, while challenging, was manageable. The population could grow without pushing people into desperation. Under such conditions, the elaborate systems of control that characterize more militarized societies might have felt unnecessary, and the investment in elaborate fortifications or warrior castes might have seemed wasteful. What we find instead, in place of weapons and fortifications, is something else entirely. We find evidence of sophisticated urban planning, of communal infrastructure, of systems designed to serve the collective rather than to elevate a single figure or dynasty. We find carefully maintained weights and measures, standardized across vast distances, suggesting that fairness in trade was valued enough to be enshrined in physical form. We find public baths and communal wells, spaces designed for people to gather and maintain the bonds that hold a society together. These are not the monuments of conquest, but they are monuments nonetheless, physical records of a different kind of strength. The absence of weapons, then, becomes not the absence of civilization, but perhaps a different expression of it. A civilization that measured its power not in the reach of its armies, but in the extent of its trade networks. That demonstrated its sophistication not through grand palaces for rulers, but through sophisticated urban infrastructure that benefited the many. That recorded its values not in scenes of triumph and subjugation, but in the careful standardization of the tools and weights and measures that made daily life possible. Whether this represents an actual achievement of peaceful coexistence or simply a different kind of silence in the archaeological record, we cannot yet know with certainty. The cities of the Indus Valley keep their deepest secrets still, yet even the most enduring civilizations carry within them the seeds of their own quieting. Around 1900 BCE, perhaps a century or two before or after, the exact moment lost to time's soft erosion, the Indus Valley began its slow, almost imperceptible retreat from the world, not with the violence of conquest, or the sudden collapse that obliterates cities in a single catastrophic night, but rather with a gentle, patient turning away. A civilization choosing, or perhaps being chosen by forces it could not arrest, to dissolve into the landscape it had so carefully ordered. The rivers, those great arteries that had nourished every street and granary and field, began to shift. The Indus itself, that temperamental artery of the northwest, moved its course. The Ghaggar-Hakra system, which had run as a substantial river during the height of urban life, dwindled into intermittent flows. What some scholars suggest may have been caused by tectonic shifts, others propose was the result of gradual drying. Imagine the slow panic of a population whose very lifeblood, the water that arrived each monsoon season, bringing silt and abundance, began to arrive less reliably, less generously. The channels that had been cleared and maintained for centuries began to run dry. Fields that had yielded cotton and barley season after season grew thirsty and parched. There is something almost melancholic about decline by water's absence. Not the drama of a flood that sweeps away in days, but the patient, persistent evaporation of a way of life. The monsoons, it appears, became less consistent. Climate records preserved in ice cores and ocean sediments suggest that the region experienced a gradual shift toward drier conditions beginning around 2000 BCE, intensifying through the following centuries. The very sky was changing its rhythm. Farmers watched the clouds gather with less certainty. The harvests that had once sustained 40,000 people in a single city began to shrink, and with the shrinking of water came the fragmentation of order. Why remain in a city built on the assumption of surplus? Why maintain the great granaries when the fields could no longer fill them with the reliability on which all civic life depended? We might imagine the first subtle signs, not a mass panic, but a slow reasoning. A family, perhaps in Mohenjo-Daro's outer quarters, deciding that the countryside villages might offer better prospects than the increasingly stressed urban center. Then another family, then a guild of craftsmen, whose markets depended on the wealth that trade and prosperity had once guaranteed. The archaeology whispers this story to us, through gradual layers of abandonment. The cities did not empty overnight. Rather, they thinned. Some neighborhoods in Mohenjo-Daro show signs of renewal, of attempts to repair and rebuild, even as other quarters slowly quieted. Smaller settlements in the surrounding regions seem to have been maintained longer, perhaps as dispersed agricultural communities adapted to the new aridity. Harappa, in the east, appears to have experienced a somewhat different trajectory than its western counterpart, suggesting that the decline was not uniformous across the entire civilization, not everywhere at the same pace. What happened to these people? This is the tender mystery at the heart of the Indus story. There was no final battle, no siege, no moment when conquerors poured through the gates. The population did not disappear. Rather, it transformed. It migrated. It dispersed into smaller settlements, into the villages and towns of what would become Vedic civilization in the northeast, into the arid zones where smaller, more flexible communities could adapt to the new climate. They were still there, still speaking, still believing, still crafting, but no longer in the coordinated, massive cities that had once ordered them so carefully. Some scholars suggest that environmental stress itself may have altered not only the geography, but the very possibility of the Indus civilization's particular form of governance. Those councils or merchant assemblies or shared civic authorities that had maintained order without overt kingship may have fractured under the pressure of scarcity. How do you maintain equity and consensus when there is no longer enough for everyone? The social glue that bound the civilization together, perhaps a shared prosperity, a shared belief in ordered abundance, may have simply worn thin. By around 1500 BCE, the great cities were largely empty. Not ruins that stood as monuments to past glory, but slowly dissolving brick by brick, their ordered streets slowly claimed by the very earth they had tried so carefully to impose geometry upon. The great bath of Mohenjo-Daro, once perhaps filled with ritual significance, fell into disuse. The covered drains, those monuments to civic engineering, began to crumble. The weights and measures that had standardized trade across hundreds of miles became meaningless when there was nothing left to trade. What is remarkable, though, is how little violence marks this transition. The archaeological record shows no mass graves, no signs of burning or destruction on a catastrophic scale. There are some burned structures, some evidence of disorder in the latest phases of occupation, but nothing that speaks of conquest or warfare reshaping the landscape. It is almost as if the Indus civilization, having existed without the imperatives of military domination, also departed without the dramatics of military overthrow. It simply stepped back. The land itself remembers these cities still. The rivers, in their present courses, flow past mounds that were once densely inhabited streets. Beneath the silt and dust, the baked bricks remain, their standardized dimensions preserved in the dry earth. a last testimony to a civilization's commitment to order. The seals lie buried, their undeciphered inscriptions waiting in darkness. The weights and measures, scattered and buried, still maintain their proportions. In the soil itself, in the pollen records, and the mineral content of clay, the slow story of climate change and agricultural decline is written in layers that science can now read, even if the script itself remains cryptic. And so the Indus Valley, after 1,000 years of increasingly sophisticated urban life, began its slow return to something smaller, something more scattered, something less visible to the gaze of history. The people did not vanish, the culture did not evaporate. But the grand experiment in large-scale civilization without kingship, in ordered complexity without conquest, in communal life sustained by consensus rather than coercion, that particular flowering gently folded in upon itself, yielding to the climate and the rivers, to time's patient reworking of all human ambitions into dust. For nearly 4,000 years, the cities of the Indus slept beneath the earth. The brick buildings that had stood in such precise geometric order crumbled slowly into the soil. The streets that had bustled with merchants and craftspeople fell silent. The great wells and the carefully laid drains were covered over by centuries of dust and the patient work of time itself. And in that long forgetting, the Indus Valley became something between legend and complete erasure, a civilization so thoroughly lost that even its name was a question mark in the minds of the world. The rediscovery, when it came, was not the result of grand archaeological ambition or the careful plans of scholars. It arrived, instead, on the side rails of a railway line. In the middle decades of the 19th century, as the British colonial administration pushed railway infrastructure across the Indian subcontinent, the engineers surveying and laying track near the town of Harappa, in what is now Punjab, found themselves in need of ballast, the loose stone and rubble used to stabilize railway beds. The workers began to quarry the ancient mounds that rose from the landscape near the Ravi River. These mounds were not dramatic or obviously important, they were simply convenient. As the laborers extracted bricks, countless bricks, from the accumulated rubble of centuries, they were, without knowing it, dismantling one of the world's great forgotten cities. The kiln-fired bricks were uniform, standardized in a way that struck observers as peculiar. Some of the bricks bore mysterious markings, symbols that repeated in patterns but meant nothing to anyone present. What was the purpose of these marks? Why had ancient workers taken such care to render them? News of the discovery reached the archaeological community only gradually. It was not until 1912 that a scholar named N.G. Majumdar recognized the significance of what was being unearthed. The script, the brick standardization, the scale of the ruins, these pointed to something far more organized and ancient than previously imagined. By then, a considerable portion of Harappa had already been dismantled, its building materials repurposed for railways and roads. It is one of the ironies of the Indus Valley's modern rediscovery that even as archaeologists began to understand its importance, some of the most valuable physical evidence was still being removed and lost. The second great site, Mohenjo-Daro, was found through more intentional archaeological work. Located in Sindh province, in what is now Pakistan, this city sat on the banks of the Indus River itself. The excavations began in earnest in the 1920s, led by archaeologists including Rakal Das Banerjee and John Marshall. And when the layers of soil and silt were carefully removed, Mohenjo-Daro revealed itself in stunning completeness. The grid-like streets emerged into daylight again, the covered drainage systems, the platforms where large structures once stood, the public baths, all of it was there, waiting. The brick sizes and building techniques matched almost precisely with what had been found at Harappa. This was no coincidence. This was evidence of a unified culture, a shared understanding of how to build and organize across vast distances. What began to take shape in the minds of archaeologists was the realization that they were not looking at scattered settlements, but at a comprehensive civilization. By the 1920s and 1930s, survey work revealed hundreds of smaller settlements across the Indus Valley Plain, and extending into the semi-arid regions beyond. Some of these were mere villages. Others were towns of considerable sophistication, but all of them seemed to share common characteristics: the same brick sizes, the same pottery styles, the same seals, the same approach to urban planning. How could a civilization so vast and unified have left so little trace of rulers and written records? How could its organization be so consistent without the kind of top-down control that normally produces such uniformity? The puzzle deepened as scholars worked. The seals were perhaps the most tantalizing objects. These small carved pieces, typically made of soapstone, bore the indecipherable script and images of animals, often a horned figure that seemed to hold ritual significance. The seals were clearly used in trade and administration. Their standardization suggested a formal system of commerce. Yet the script itself remained stubbornly resistant to decipherment. Scholars could count the symbols, could observe their frequency, could notice that they seemed to follow grammatical patterns. Some attempted to decode them using comparative linguistics, trying to match the symbols to later Indian writing systems. But nothing held. The Indus script kept its secrets. The ceramics and objects of daily life painted a picture of communities engaged in craftwork of high quality. Terracotta figurines emerged from the soil. Small sculptures of animals, of dancers, of figures whose purposes we can only imagine. Beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli turned up in quantity, suggesting not just local craftsmanship, but an elaborate network of material exchange. The weight systems used by traders seemed to follow precise mathematical ratios. Everything pointed to a civilization of considerable intellectual sophistication and economic complexity. And yet there were almost no weapons found, no evidence of large-scale fortifications, no depictions of warfare in the surviving art. What kind of ancient people built such organized cities but seemed to have no need for armies? Piece by piece, through decades of careful excavation and cataloging, a portrait emerged. The work of scholars like Mortimer Wheeler, who brought rigorous stratigraphic methods to the excavations, helped establish a chronology. The Indus civilization, it became clear, had flourished roughly between 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era. This placed it as contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom and with Mesopotamian civilization. It was, in other words, one of the world's great ancient traditions, emerging independently and following its own trajectory. The civilization had developed on its own terms, with its own values, and its own solutions to the problems of organizing large populations. Yet the deeper archaeologists dug, the more mysterious it became. How had such a civilization simply ended? What had caused its decline? The cities had not been destroyed in a sudden cataclysm, as was sometimes theorized. Instead, they seemed to have been gradually abandoned. The population dispersed, the great urban centers emptied. Over generations, the Indus Valley civilization dissolved back into smaller, less organized settlements. The memory of it faded entirely. By the time historical records resumed in the region, the great cities were already forgotten. The script had been lost. The system of governance, whatever it had been, had dissolved. And so began the long work of interpretation, the patient effort to reconstruct from fragments and shards, and the careful observation of brick and drain, the shape of a world that had vanished. Even now, more than a century after the rediscovery began, questions remain. The script still has not been definitively translated. The exact nature of the civilization's governance remains a matter of scholarly debate. Why did it decline? Where did its people go? What did they believe? What happened to the knowledge system that had created such organized cities? These are the questions that archaeologists continue to work through. The answer lies not in grand monuments or royal inscriptions, for the Indus civilization left none. It lies instead in the accumulated details, in the uniformity of bricks, in the careful placement of drains, in the shared weights and measures, in the seals that were used in trade, in the small figurines that suggest ritual life and imagination. It lies in the stubborn silence of a civilization that seemed to prefer order to display, coordination to conquest. The rediscovery of the Indus Valley has given us not answers, perhaps, but better questions. And those questions continue to reshape our understanding of what ancient civilization could be. As we draw back from the quiet streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, from the dust-covered workshops and the patient hands of craftspeople long dissolved into time, there emerges a question that lingers in the mind with the persistence of evening light across water. What does a civilization tell us when it chooses not to shout its name in monuments of conquest, or etch its supremacy into stone? The Indus Valley peoples, for all their sophistication, their engineering precision, their far-flung networks of exchange, left behind no epic inscriptions praising a king, no royal hunt frozen in relief, no triumphal arches, no names of the mighty carved to echo through eternity, and perhaps in that silence, there is something we have forgotten how to listen for. For 5 centuries, maybe longer, this civilization maintained order without the visible machinery of oppression that we have come to expect from the historical record. No standing armies found in the archaeological layers, no fortification walls rising in arrogant defense, no pyramids built on the backs of forced labor, no temples where a god-king demanded worship and tribute. Yet somehow, across a region larger than the lands where Mesopotamian kings ruled and Egyptian pharaohs commanded the Nile, there existed coordination, there existed planning, there existed a society complex enough to manage trade, standardize weights and measures, organize the building of cities, and sustain tens of thousands of people in relative stability. We have looked at the evidence and offered theories, turning them carefully in our minds, like scholars examining fragments. Perhaps councils of merchants held sway, their decisions made in closed rooms we will never see. Perhaps religious authority, quiet and accepted, guided the hand of artisans and administrators. Perhaps there was something closer to democracy in its most intimate form, where community decisions emerged from deliberation and shared interest. Or perhaps the very concept of governance we bring to the ruins, weighted as it is with our own history of kings and courts and power vested in singular bodies, is the wrong lens entirely. We may be looking for what was never there, asking the wrong questions of the earth. What strikes us now, after all these years of excavation and interpretation, is not what the Indus Valley civilization possessed, but what it so conspicuously did not pursue. Not conquest, not the accumulation of treasure in a single dynasty's vault, not the building of monuments to individual glory, not the creation of a system where some ruled and others labored without choice. Here was a people who fed themselves through agricultural wisdom and animal husbandry, who adorned themselves with beads and wore fine cotton, who bathed in water arranged with deliberate care, who made beauty in their seals and in the proportions of their buildings, who traded across vast distances without apparent need to subjugate those distant peoples, who seemed to understand that their own survival and prosperity lay in maintaining relationships, not in dominating them. In our own time, when we are taught that civilization's progress is measured in conquest and growth, in the expansion of territory and the reach of power, the Indus Valley whispers a different story. It suggests, softly and without insistence, that there may have been another way, a way where a complex society could exist without the constant infrastructure of force, where people could be organized through shared purpose, through trade and ritual and the bonds of community, where the good life meant the possibility of safety, of meaningful work, of participation in building something that lasted. We do not know, and we must admit this openly, whether the Indus Valley was as peaceful as it appears. Perhaps violence was subdued, kept private, not etched into public monuments because a different culture deemed such display unseemly. Perhaps there were conflicts we have no way of seeing. Perhaps women and workers lived under constraints that left no trace in the brick and stone. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. And yet, the physical record does not lie about what was prioritized. The weights and measures were standardized. The drains and water systems were communal. The workshops were distributed across cities rather than concentrated in palaces. The ordinary dwelling was modest and sufficient. These choices, repeated across centuries, and across hundreds of miles, suggests something deliberate about how these people chose to organize themselves. To stand in the ruins of these cities now is to feel the presence of a question that becomes more urgent with each passing year of our own history. How shall we live together? What must a civilization demand from its people, and what can it choose to forego? Is it necessary to have conquerors and conquered, rulers and ruled? Must every complex society rest upon hierarchy, upon power accumulated and hoarded? The Indus Valley does not answer these questions for us. It could not. Different times call forth different solutions. But it does demonstrate that for a long time, on a vast stretch of earth, another arrangement proved possible. Perhaps this is why the Indus Valley holds us. Not because we wish to recreate it exactly, not because we can pretend that their world is our world, or that their solutions are ours to borrow wholesale, but because in their stones and their seals, and their careful arrangement of the domestic space, they preserved evidence of a choice to build something that did not require the constant proving of dominance, a choice to create abundance without the violent accumulation that we have come to see as inevitable. In the long sleep that overcame these cities, as the rivers shifted their courses, and the climate grew harsher, and the people gradually moved away, something was not lost so much as transformed. The knowledge stayed, the DNA remained. The descendants of those who built Mohenjo-Daro became other peoples, carried their ingenuity and their bloodlines into what would become the cultures of South Asia. Genetic echoes of the Indus Valley persist in the peoples of the Indian subcontinent still, a living continuity that no destruction could wholly erase. And now, with the passage of thousands of years, with so much of the world transformed beyond recognition, with technology and power concentrated in ways those ancient peoples could never have imagined, we find ourselves looking back at what they built and wondering what it would have felt like to live in a world without the constant roar of domination, wondering whether the peace we see in the archaeological layers was hard-won and real, or merely the absence of sufficient violence to leave a mark, wondering whether we might learn something from people who seem to understand that the point of building a civilization was not to glorify a few at the expense of the many, but to create a space where many could live and work and make offerings at wells that served the whole. This civilization, which asked no one to bow before a king, which seemed to understand that water and ritual and commerce and the daily rhythms of craft could bind a people more reliably than the fear of force, now rests quietly beneath the earth. In the museums where fragments of its seals are kept under glass, in the excavation sites where patient archaeologists still work to understand the script and the systems of organization, in the genetic and linguistic traces that reach down through millennia, it continues its slow conversation with us. What it whispers is not a blueprint for utopia, not a promise that we might return to some golden age. What it whispers is this: there was once a way of being together that looked different from what we have been taught to expect. There was complexity without tyranny, organization without kings, stability maintained not through the threat of weapons, but through something more subtle and perhaps more durable. For a time, it worked, and the fact that it worked at all, across such distances and for such a span of years, suggests that the arrangements we accept as permanent and necessary might be, in truth, only one possibility among many. As you drift now in the stillness of the night, let that thought settle beside you like the dust settling on ancient bricks, like the hush that comes when a great civilization at last rests from its labors. The Indus Valley is gone, transformed, faded into the very soil from which it grew, and yet, in some way that defies simple explanation, it remains. It remains in the questions it poses. It remains in the evidence of what humans once managed to create when they chose a different path. It remains in the quiet knowledge that civilization need not roar to be magnificent, that a city can be great not because it conquered, but because it endured, because its people found ways to live together that honored both the individual and the community, both the practical and the sacred. In the darkness now, in the warmth of rest, you might imagine those ancient streets as they were in some calm evening, the workshops growing still, The drains carrying away the day's water with their perfect engineering, the seals laid out for tomorrow's trade, the cotton hung to dry, the wells full of the shared resource that sustained everything. A world where the greatest monument was not the temple of a god-king, but the careful arrangement of 1,000 everyday things, each one fitted into its proper place in a vast and intricate pattern, peaceful, orderly, complex, unknown, utterly, profoundly human. And there, in that imagined twilight, let us leave them. Let us leave them as they were, as they seem to have been. A civilization that asked for no monuments and left behind only mysteries, only fragments, only the quiet evidence that another way had been possible. The rest is silence. The rest is memory. The rest is the slow dissolving into sleep that comes to all things. And in that dissolving, perhaps, there is a kind of peace.